Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the forgotten corners of the ancient world. Tonight's lit by firelight when voices carried secrets through the dark. To the stories the poets didn't shout about, but whispered to those who would listen. Tales of gods and monsters you've never met. Heroes whose names were almost lost. And choices that shaped history, even if the world forgot their names. Before we begin, if you enjoy quiet, dark stories from the past, feel free to support the channel with a free subscription. And tell me, where are you watching from right now? I read every comment. It's always amazing to see people tuning in from all over the world. So, find a quiet place. This is Myth Night, where you can close your eyes and drift into the Greek myths the world never told you. In the beginning, before light ever touched the world, there was only darkness. Not the frightening darkness that comes with shadows and fear, but the deep, peaceful darkness of infinite possibility. This was the realm of Nyx, the primordial goddess of night, whose power stretched back to the very dawn of creation itself. Picture the world as it was then: no sun, no moon, no stars scattered across the heavens like diamonds on black velvet. Only the vast, eternal embrace of night, gentle and all-encompassing. Nyx moved through this darkness like a woman walking through her own home, comfortable and sovereign in every corner of existence. She was not born as the other gods were born. Nyx emerged from chaos itself, one of the first beings to take form when the universe began to organize itself from the swirling void. Her beauty was unlike anything that would come after, not the golden radiance of Aphrodite or the silver grace of Artemis, but something deeper and more mysterious. Her skin held the deep blue-black of midnight sky, and her hair flowed like liquid starlight, though stars had not yet been created. When Nyx spread her dark wings across the heavens, they stretched from one end of the cosmos to the other. These wings were not feathered like a bird's, but made of the very substance of night itself, soft as silk, dark as the space between thoughts, comforting as a mother's embrace. As she flew across the early world, she trailed behind her a veil of darkness that brought rest to all living things. Her palace stood at the edge of the world, where day and night meet but never touch. Built from crystallized moonbeams and shadows made solid, it rose like a mountain of black glass into the perpetual twilight. No mortal ever saw this place, but travelers who journeyed far enough in their dreams sometimes caught glimpses of its towers through the mist of sleep. In the great halls of her palace, Nyx ruled over her many children, sleep and death, dreams and nightmares, the fates who spin the threads of mortal lives, and countless other spirits of the dark hours. Unlike the chaotic family gatherings on Mount Olympus, Nyx's court was a place of quiet dignity and ancient wisdom. Her children moved through the halls like whispers, each attending to their sacred duties with the solemnity that comes from understanding the true weight of their responsibilities. But it was Nyx's relationship with Zeus that revealed the true extent of her power. Even after he had overthrown the Titans and established himself as king of the gods, even when his thunderbolts could shake the foundations of Mount Olympus and his word had become cosmic law, Zeus still stepped aside when Nyx passed by. The ancient stories tell us that the king of gods feared nothing in all of creation except the primal darkness from which everything had emerged. This fear was not born of cowardice, but of wisdom. Zeus understood that Nyx represented something older and more fundamental than his own authority. She was night itself, the necessary counterpart today, the peaceful darkness that allows all living things to rest and regenerate. Without her gentle embrace, the world would burn itself out in constant blazing activity. Even gods need rest, and Nyx provided the cosmic rhythm that kept existence itself in balance. The goddess rarely interfered in the affairs of mortals or even of the younger gods. She had no need to prove her power or demand worship through grand gestures. Her influence was subtler, but more profound. Every time a tired mother finally fell asleep after tending to her children, Nyx was there. Every time a wounded soldier found peace in unconsciousness, every time a grieving heart found temporary respite in dreams, her gentle touch provided comfort. In the mortal world, some night-blooming flowers were sacred to her, jasmine that released its sweetest fragrance only in darkness, moonflowers that opened their petals exclusively under the stars. Owls, those wise birds who see clearly in the dark, served as her messengers. The rustling of leaves in the evening breeze carried her whispers to those who knew how to listen. Ancient priests who served Nyx held their ceremonies in complete darkness, understanding that artificial light would be an insult to their goddess. They moved through their rituals by memory and touch, offering prayers that were spoken so softly they seemed like thoughts rather than words. These priests learned to find their way, not by sight but by feeling, developing an almost supernatural ability to navigate in perfect blackness. The goddess particularly blessed those who worked while others slept, the bakers who rose before dawn to prepare the day's bread, the watchmen who guarded city walls through the dangerous hours, the midwives who delivered babies in the quiet darkness of the early morning. She understood that some of the most important work happens when the rest of the world is lost in dreams. Nyx also ruled over the realm of sleep and dreams, that mysterious country we all visit every night, but never fully understand. In her domain, the laws of waking life dissolved like sugar in water. Time moved differently there. Minutes could stretch into hours, or years could pass in the space of a heartbeat. The dead could speak with the living. Impossible things became commonplace, and the deepest truths of the heart revealed themselves in symbols and images that logic could never decode. Her son Hypnos, the god of sleep, learned his gentle art from watching his mother's work. She taught him how to approach mortals with the softest touch, how to ease the tension from tired muscles and quiet the endless chatter of worried minds. Under Nyx's guidance, sleep became not just a physical necessity, but a sacred ritual, a nightly return to the peaceful darkness from which all life emerged. Dreams, too, were her special province. She understood that in sleep, the barriers between different levels of reality became permeable. Prophetic visions could slip through the cracks between worlds, messages from the gods could be delivered in symbolic form, and the deepest wisdom of the soul could rise to the surface like oil on water. The dreams that came during the darkest hours of night, just before dawn, were often the most significant, carrying truths that daylight consciousness could never grasp. As the world aged and the younger gods established their dominance, mortals sometimes forgot the ancient power of Nyx. They built cities so bright that her natural darkness was pushed to the margins, created lives so busy that they barely noticed her nightly visitations. But the goddess remained patient, understanding that all things return to darkness eventually. Stars burn out, civilizations fall, even mountains crumble to dust, but night remains eternal, patient, and welcoming. Those who remembered her gifts and honored her presence found their lives touched by a peculiar grace. Their sleep came easier and deeper. Their dreams carried wisdom and healing. They developed an intuitive understanding of life's rhythms, knowing when to act and when to rest, when to speak and when to remain silent. They learned that darkness was not the enemy of light, but its necessary partner, that rest was not laziness, but the foundation of all productive activity. In her timeless palace at the world's edge, Nyx continues her ancient work, spinning the threads of night across the sky, weaving dreams into the sleeping minds of mortals, and maintaining the cosmic balance that keeps existence itself from spinning into chaos. She asks for no temples, demands no sacrifices, requires no elaborate ceremonies. Her worship is as simple as closing your eyes and surrendering to the gentle darkness that embraces all living things. And when night falls and the first stars appears in the darkening sky, when the evening breeze carries the scent of night-blooming flowers and the last birds of day give way to the first sounds of nocturnal creatures stirring, remember that you are entering the sacred realm of the most ancient goddess, older than Zeus, older than the Titans, older than light itself. In her embrace, all the troubles of the day fade like distant thunder, and the soul finds the peace it has been seeking since the very beginning of time. Far beyond the northern winds, beyond the lands where snow never melts and ice stretches to the horizon, there lies a realm that exists at the very edge of the known world. This is the mysterious island of the Hyperboreans, a place so distant that few mortals have ever glimpsed it, and fewer still have returned to tell of its wonders. Yet in the depths of winter, when the world grows cold and dark, it is here that Apollo himself travels, trading his bright chariot for a season of perfect, eternal warmth. The name itself tells part of the story, Hyperboreans, meaning beyond the north wind. For while Boreas, the fierce north wind, brings frost and storm to the rest of the world, his icy breath cannot reach this blessed island. Some invisible barrier, woven from sunlight and divine will, protects this sanctuary from all the harsh realities that plague ordinary lands. Imagine approaching this island by ship, though no ordinary vessel could make such a journey. The sea around it does not freeze, despite the Arctic location. Instead, the water holds a peculiar warmth, as if heated by some underground spring, and it glows with a soft, golden light that makes navigation possible even in that endless polar night. The air itself shimmers with an opalescent quality, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but gentle and welcoming rather than harsh. As your boat draws closer to shore, the first thing you notice is the complete absence of seasons. Where the rest of the world suffers through the cycle of growth and decay, abundance and want, the island of the Hyperboreans exists in a state of eternal spring. Trees bear fruit and flowers simultaneously, their branches heavy with both blossoms and ripened offerings. Grass grows thick and green year-round, soft as silk beneath bare feet, never needing the renewal that comes with seasonal death and rebirth. The Hyperboreans themselves are beings of extraordinary beauty and grace, tall and fair-skinned, with hair like spun gold and eyes that reflect the unchanging blue of their perfect sky. They move with the fluid elegance of dancers, as if gravity affects them differently than it does ordinary mortals. Their clothing seems to be woven from light itself, gossamer garments that shift and shimmer with every movement, never wearing out, never needing replacement. These blessed people know neither age nor sickness nor death in the way that other mortals understand them. Time passes differently here, measured not by the relentless march of years, but by the rhythm of divine festivals and the cycles of celestial music that fill the air. A day on their island might equal a year in the outside world, or perhaps it is the reverse. The relationship between their time and ours remains one of the great mysteries. The cities of the Hyperboreans rise like crystalline dreams from landscapes that seem painted by the gods themselves. Their buildings are constructed not from stone or wood, but from some translucent material that captures and refracts light, creating rainbow patterns that dance across every surface. These structures grow rather than being built, shaped by collective will and divine blessing into forms of perfect harmony and beauty. At the heart of their greatest city stands the Temple of Apollo, and it is here that the true wonder of the Hyperborean realm reveals itself. This is not a temple built by mortal hands, but a living structure that changes with the god's presence. When Apollo is with them during the winter months, the temple blazes with golden light, so pure and warm that it can be seen from the farthest corners of the island. The walls seem to breathe with music, producing harmonies so beautiful that even the wind pauses to listen. The Hyperboreans worship Apollo not with the desperate prayers of mortals seeking divine intervention, but with a joy that comes from living in direct communion with divine presence. Their festivals are not occasional celebrations, but a continuous expression of gratitude and love that flows through their daily lives like an underground river. They dance not because they have been commanded to do so, but because their bodies cannot help but move in rhythm with the cosmic music that fills their air. Their music itself is said to be incomparable to anything heard in the mortal world. Where human songs are limited by the capabilities of voice and instrument, Hyperborean music incorporates the sound of wind through crystal trees, the harmonies created by light refracting through their architecture, and the subtle rhythms of their own enhanced heartbeats. Listeners from the outside world, on the rare occasions when such music has been heard, report that it seems to tune their very souls, healing wounds they didn't know they carried, and awakening aspirations they had never dared to dream. Apollo's arrival each winter transforms the island even beyond its normal state of perfection. The god comes not in his blazing chariot, but walking softly through groves that part before him like curtains. Animals that exist nowhere else in creation gather to welcome him. Deer with antlers of living silver, birds whose songs can predict the future, butterflies whose wings are painted with constellations that mirror the night sky of distant lands. During his residence among them, Apollo teaches the Hyperboreans secrets that are hidden from the rest of humanity. He shares with them the deeper mysteries of music, showing how sound can heal not just emotional wounds, but physical ones as well. He reveals to them the hidden connections between mathematics and harmony, between the movement of planets and the rhythm of the human heart. Under his guidance, they create art forms that have no names in any human language, expressions of beauty so pure that they seem to make the very air around them more substantial. The god also uses his time among the Hyperboreans to rest and renew himself. Even divine beings need respite from the constant demands of their cosmic responsibilities. Here, Apollo can lay aside his burden of bringing light to the world and simply exist in the eternal brightness that the Hyperboreans have created through their devotion. He can compose music for its own sake rather than to inspire mortals, can practice his archery without the need to strike down monsters or deliver divine justice. The Hyperboreans, in turn, serve Apollo not as slaves or suppliants, but as friends and artistic collaborators. They understand that their blessed existence comes not from their own merit, but from their role as caretakers of this sacred space. They maintain their island not just as a home for themselves, but as a retreat where divine beauty can exist without compromise, where perfect harmony can be preserved against the chaos that inevitably creeps into the mortal world. The festivals celebrated during Apollo's residence are spectacles beyond mortal imagination. Processions wind through the crystal cities, carrying offerings that are themselves works of art, sculptures carved from solidified sunlight, tapestries woven from the aurora borealis, instruments that produce music even when no one is playing them. The entire population participates, not as worshippers looking up to a distant deity, but as beloved friends celebrating the return of someone precious. Ancient writers tell us that the Hyperboreans sometimes send gifts to Apollo's other temples, particularly to the sacred island of Delos, where the god was born. These offerings travel by mysterious means, sometimes carried by the wind itself, sometimes brought by sacred birds that fly impossible distances without rest. The gifts are always perfect examples of Hyperborean craftsmanship, arrows that never miss their mark, lyres that play the music of the spheres, golden wheat that never spoils and can feed multitudes. But the island's greatest gift to the outside world may be its very existence as proof that perfection is possible. In a universe filled with suffering and loss, with the constant struggle between order and chaos, the Hyperborean realm stands as evidence that harmony can triumph, that beauty can endure, and that somewhere, if only at the edges of reality, divine peace can be maintained without compromise. The journey to reach their island, however, remains beyond the capabilities of ordinary mortals. The path lies not just through physical space, but through layers of reality that require divine assistance to navigate. Those few heroes who have glimpsed the Hyperborean shore have done so only with the direct intervention of the gods, and most of them remember their visit only as the most beautiful dream they ever experienced. Yet on the coldest winter nights, when the north wind howls and the darkness seems endless, sensitive souls sometimes catch echoes of Hyperborean music on the wind. In those moments, the eternal spring of Apollo's winter refuge touches our world just lightly enough to remind us that somewhere beyond the reach of mortal troubles, perfect beauty continues its ancient dance, waiting patiently for the day when all the world might share in its timeless grace. The fire crackles softly in the palace hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls where tapestries tell stories of heroes and gods. But tonight, the flames seem different somehow, more urgent, more alive, as if they remember another fire that burned long ago and changed the fate of a kingdom. This is the story of Meleager, the prince whose life was tied to a piece of wood, and whose mother faced the most terrible choice any parent could imagine. Queen Althea of Caledon had waited long for a child. She and King Oeneus had ruled their prosperous kingdom for years, blessed in every way except the one that mattered most to their hearts. When she finally felt the first stirrings of life within her womb, her joy was so complete that it seemed the very walls of the palace might burst from the happiness contained within them. The birth was difficult, as royal births often were, lasting through an entire night and well into the next day. But when the midwives finally placed the healthy baby boy in Althea's arms, her exhaustion vanished like mist before the morning sun. Here was her son, her heir, the future of Caledon, a perfect child with strong limbs and a voice that promised great things to come. The celebration lasted for days. Nobles came from neighboring kingdoms to offer gifts and pledge their loyalty to the new prince. Poets composed verses about his future heroic deeds. The common people gathered in the streets, sharing wine and stories, their hearts lifted by the promise of continued prosperity under a new generation of leadership. But on the seventh night after Meleager's birth, when the last guests had departed and the palace had settled into quiet contentment, something extraordinary happened. Althea lay sleeping beside her infant son's cradle when a strange light began to fill the room. At first, she thought dawn was breaking unusually early, but this light had a quality that no earthly sunrise could match. Silver and gold woven together, soft yet brilliant, familiar yet utterly otherworldly. 3 figures materialized from this divine radiance, and Althea's breath caught in her throat as she recognized them. The Fates had come to her son's cradle, those ancient sisters who spin the threads of every mortal life, who determine the length and pattern of each human existence. Clotho, who spins the thread of life, stood at the foot of the cradle, her spindle moving with steady rhythm. Lachesis, who measures the thread's length, held her ruler poised above the sleeping child. And Atropos, she who cuts the thread when life must end, kept her great shears closed but ready. Althea dared not move, barely dared to breathe, as the three sisters examined her son. They spoke in voices like wind through autumn leaves, discussing the child's fate with the calm detachment of beings who have witnessed the birth and death of countless mortals. They saw in the sleeping infant the seeds of greatness, courage that would make him a legendary hero, strength that would allow him to face monsters and emerge victorious, nobility that would inspire songs for generations to come. But then Atropos looked toward the fireplace, where a single log burned with steady flame, and her expression grew troubled. "See there," she said to her sisters, her voice carrying the weight of unavoidable destiny. "This child's life is bound to that piece of wood. When the log is completely consumed by fire, when the last ember dies and turns to ash, his life will end with it." The words hit Altheus like physical blows. She watched in horror as the log continued to burn, its surface blackening, its substance slowly transforming into glowing coals. Every spark that rose up the chimney seemed to carry away a piece of her son's future. In that moment, maternal love overrode all other considerations. Without thinking, she leaped from her bed and snatched the burning log from the fire, smothering its flames with whatever cloth came to hand. The Fates watched her desperate actions with expressions that might have been approval or might have been pity. It was impossible to tell with beings so ancient and removed from mortal concerns. They had delivered their prophecy, fulfilled their cosmic obligation to reveal the truth of the child's destiny. What Althea chose to do with that knowledge was her own responsibility, her own burden to bear. As quickly as they had appeared, the three sisters faded back into the divine light from which they had emerged, leaving Althea alone with her sleeping son and the half-burned log that now held his life in its charred wood. She could feel the residual heat radiating from its surface, could smell the lingering smoke that seemed to carry the scent of fate itself. With shaking hands, she wrapped the log in silk and placed it in an iron chest, which she locked with 3 different keys. The chest she hid in the deepest vault beneath the palace, where no fire could reach it, where no accident could threaten its precious contents. She told no one of what she had done, not her husband, not her closest servants, not even the priests who might have offered counsel. This secret was hers alone to carry. Years passed, and Meleager grew into everything the Fates had promised he would become. Tall and strong, with his mother's quick intelligence and his father's courage, he proved himself in hunt after hunt, battle after battle. His fame spread throughout Greece as one of the greatest heroes of his generation. He joined Jason and the Argonauts in their quest for the Golden Fleece, sailed with them through dangers that would have claimed lesser men, and returned home covered in glory. But it was the Caledonian boar hunt that would make his name immortal in the annals of heroic achievement. Artemis, offended because King Oeneus had forgotten to include her in his harvest sacrifices, sent a monstrous boar to ravage the countryside around Caledon. This was no ordinary wild pig, but a creature of supernatural size and fury, with tusks like ivory spears and hide so thick that normal weapons could barely penetrate it. Heroes came from across the known world to participate in the hunt. Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, arrived from Sparta. Theseus came from Athens, still flush with victory over the Minotaur. Peleus, father of the future Achilles, brought his legendary spear. Even a few bold women joined the expedition, including the huntress Atalanta, whose skill with the bow rivaled that of Artemis herself. The hunt lasted for days, with the great boar proving cleverer and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. It killed several heroes outright, wounded many others, and seemed to grow stronger and more vicious with each passing hour. But finally, through a combination of strategy, courage, and divine favor, Meleager managed to deliver the killing blow that ended the creature's rampage. According to the ancient customs of the hunt, the hero who struck the final blow had the right to claim the boar's hide as a trophy. But Meleager, moved by admiration for Atalanta's courage and skill, awarded the prize to her instead. His gesture was noble and generous, the act of a man who valued honor above personal glory. But not everyone saw it that way. Meleager's uncles, his mother's brothers, were outraged by what they saw as an insult to their family's dignity. How dare their nephew give away a prize that should have brought honor to their bloodline? Their anger grew with each cup of wine they consumed at the victory feast, fed by pride and masculine vanity, until it became a burning rage that demanded satisfaction. The confrontation came suddenly, sparked by harsh words that escalated into drawn swords. In the battle that followed, Meleager was forced to defend himself against his own relatives. His skill with weapons, honed by years of heroic adventures, proved superior to theirs. When the violence ended, both of his uncles lay dead by his hand, their blood staining the ground where they had fallen. Word of the killings reached Althea like a thunderbolt. Her brothers, the companions of her childhood, slain by her own son over a matter of wounded pride. Grief and rage warred in her heart, each emotion feeding the other, until she could barely think clearly. The rational part of her mind understood that Meleager had acted in self-defense, that her brothers had forced the confrontation through their own arrogance and jealousy. But the emotional wounds cut too deep for reason to heal. In her fury and heartbreak, Althea made her way to the hidden vault where she had concealed the log that held her son's life. Her hands shook as she turned the 3 keys, lifted the heavy lid, and gazed upon the piece of wood that had remained unchanged through all the years of careful preservation. It seemed smaller somehow than she remembered, more fragile, almost pitiful in its ordinariness. For a long moment, she stood there holding her son's fate in her hands, torn between the love that had made her save it and the grief that now demanded justice for her murdered brothers. In the end, maternal love proved weaker than the ancient laws of blood vengeance. With tears streaming down her face, she carried the log to the palace's main hearth and cast it into the flames. The wood caught fire immediately, as if it had been waiting 20 years for this moment. The flames seemed to burn with unusual intensity, consuming the log with eager hunger. And far away, wherever Meleager was at that moment, he felt the first touch of an inexplicable weakness, a strange emptiness that began to spread through his limbs like cold water. As the log burned, Meleager's strength failed him. He sank to his knees, then collapsed entirely, his breathing becoming shallow and labored. Those who were with him could find no wound, no poison, no explanation for his sudden decline. They could only watch helplessly as the life slowly drained from one of the greatest heroes of their age. The log burned completely, reducing itself to ash and memory. And at the exact moment when the last ember died, Meleager drew his final breath and passed into the Shadowlands from which no hero returns. His death sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world, for heroes were not supposed to die so mysteriously, so completely separated from the battlefield glory that should have claimed them. When word reached Althea of what she had done, the magnitude of her action crashed down upon her like a collapsing mountain. In her grief and anger, she had not just killed her son, she had destroyed the future of her kingdom, eliminated the next generation of royal leadership, and brought an end to a bloodline that stretched back to the heroes of old. The weight of that knowledge proved too much for her to bear. Some stories say she took her own life in despair. Others claim that the gods, moved by pity for her torment, transformed her into a bird so that she could fly away from the consequences of her choice. The story of Meleager and the burning log became a cautionary tale told throughout the ancient world, a reminder that even the greatest heroes are not immune to the power of fate, and that the deepest love can sometimes lead to the most terrible destruction. It spoke to universal fears about the fragility of life, the weight of family loyalty, and the impossible choices that sometimes confront us when love and justice demand contradictory actions. In the quiet moments when the fire burns low and shadows gather in the corners of the room, we might remember Althea's vigil, watching over that precious log for 20 years, knowing that its destruction would take her son, but hoping that day would never come. Her story reminds us that some burdens are too heavy for any one person to carry, and that the price of protecting those we love can sometimes prove higher than we ever imagined possible. In the time before memory, when the world was young and the gods were still establishing the laws that would govern all existence, a terrible crime was committed that would forever change the nature of justice itself. The sky god Uranus, in his cruelty and fear, had imprisoned his own children in the depths of the earth, refusing to let them see the light he ruled over. His wife, Gaia, the earth itself, could bear this injustice no longer. She called upon her son Kronos to free his siblings, providing him with an adamantine sickle that could cut through divine flesh. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Kronos struck when his father was most vulnerable, castrating him with the divine blade and casting the severed flesh into the sea. But as Uranus's blood fell upon the earth, something unprecedented happened. Where each drop struck the ground, the soil began to stir and bubble, giving birth to creatures that had never existed before, beings born from violence and divine suffering, destined to ensure that such crimes would never go unpunished. These were the Erinyes, the Furies, the avengers of blood guilt, whose very existence would become a constant reminder that justice exists beyond the power of any king or god to prevent. 3 in number, they emerged from the blood-soaked earth, fully formed and terrible to behold, their purpose burned into their divine essence from the moment of their birth. Alecto was the first to rise, her name meaning unceasing, for the anger of blood calls out until it is answered, and no passage of time can diminish its demand for justice. Her hair writhed with living serpents that hissed and coiled with every movement of her head, their eyes glowing like coals in the darkness. Her skin held the pale color of things that live far from sunlight, and her voice, when she chose to speak, carried the sound of grinding stone and weeping combined. Tisiphone followed, avenger of murder, whose very presence could drive the guilty to madness. Where Alecto embodied the relentless pursuit of justice, Tisiphone represented its terrible fulfillment. In her hands she carried a whip made from braided scorpions, their stingers dripping with venom that could inflict not just physical pain, but the deeper agony of inescapable guilt. Her eyes burned with fires that reflected the torment she was born to inflict upon those who shed family blood. The third and most terrible was Megaera, jealous rage, who pursued those who committed crimes of passion, who killed in anger or betrayal. Her wings, when she spread them, could blot out the sun, and the wind that moved beneath them carried the scent of old blood and ancient grief. In her claws she held iron torches that burned with cold flame, light that illuminated guilt rather than dispelling darkness. These three sisters made their home in the deepest parts of the underworld, in caverns that echoed with the cries of the unavenged dead. Their palace, if it could be called that, was built from the bones of murderers and decorated with the chains that had once bound their victims. Here they held court, listening to the complaints of spirits who had died by violence, weighing the evidence of crimes that earthly justice had failed to address. The Erinyes recognized no authority higher than the law of blood itself. They bowed to no king, feared no god, acknowledged no power that could release them from their sacred duty. Even Zeus, master of Olympus, treated them with careful respect, understanding that their purpose served a cosmic necessity that even he could not overturn without risking the collapse of moral order itself. Their most famous intervention came in the case of Orestes, son of Agamemnon, whose story became a testament to the terrible complexity of justice when family loyalties conflict with cosmic law. The chain of blood guilt that led to his torment began with his father's decision to sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, to ensure favorable winds for the voyage to Troy. That innocent blood, spilled for political necessity, created a debt that would poison his entire family line. Clytemnestra, Orestes' mother, had never forgiven her husband for murdering their daughter. She waited through the long years of the Trojan War, her grief and anger growing stronger with each passing season until they became an implacable hunger for revenge. When Agamemnon finally returned home, victorious but unrepentant, she struck him down in his own bath, aided by her lover Aegisthus. The king's blood mixed with the bathwater, creating a crimson pool that seemed to reflect all the violence that had led to this moment. But Clytemnestra's revenge, justified though it might have seemed, created its own debt of blood. For she had killed not just a husband, but a father, not just a warrior, but a king, and the cosmic balance demanded an accounting. The murder might have been personal, but its consequences would be universal, affecting the stability of the entire royal line and the kingdom it protected. Years passed before the next act in this tragedy unfolded. Orestes had been sent away as a child, protected from the violence that had claimed his father and the madness that had consumed his mother. But as he grew to manhood, the weight of his obligation became impossible to ignore. Apollo himself commanded him to avenge his father's death, while human law and filial duty demanded the same action. Yet to kill his mother would be to commit the most terrible crime imaginable, matricide, the violations of the sacred bond between parent and child. Torn between these impossible demands, Orestes finally chose to obey the god's command. With his sister Electra as his accomplice, he returned to his ancestral palace in disguise and struck down both Clytemnestra and her lover. The deed was done quickly, but its consequences would last far longer than a human lifetime. The moment Clytemnestra's blood touched the palace floor, the Erinyes felt her death like a physical blow. Here was their ultimate concern, a son who had spilled his mother's blood, a crime so fundamental that it threatened the very foundations of family and society. They rose from their underground realm like smoke from a burning building, terrible in their righteous anger, implacable in their purpose. When they appeared to Orestes, he understood immediately that his torment had only begun. These were not creatures that could be reasoned with, or bought off, or escaped through clever strategies. They were justice itself made manifest, the living embodiment of consequences that no human action could avoid forever. Their serpentine hair writhed around faces that held no mercy, no forgiveness, no possibility of compromise. The pursuit that followed became legendary throughout the ancient world. Orestes fled from city to city, but the Erinyes followed everywhere, visible only to him but affecting everyone around him. His very presence brought unease, as if people could sense the supernatural horror that dogged his steps, even when they couldn't see its source. Food turned to ash in his mouth, wine became bitter as wormwood, and sleep brought only nightmares filled with the sound of beating wings and hissing serpents. The Furies' torment was not merely physical, but psychological and spiritual. They whispered to him constantly, reminding him of his crime, describing in vivid detail the moment when his sword had pierced his mother's flesh, forcing him to relive the horror again and again until the memory became more real than the present moment. They showed him visions of Clytemnestra's ghost, her wounds still bleeding, her eyes filled with the terrible sadness of a mother betrayed by her own child. For years this persecution continued, until Orestes was reduced to a shadow of his former self, hollow-eyed and trembling, more ghost than man. He consulted every oracle, visited every temple, performed every ritual of purification known to mortal knowledge, but nothing could free him from the Furies' relentless pursuit. They had been born from divine blood to fulfill exactly this purpose, and they would not be denied their due. Finally, in desperation, Orestes made his way to Athens and threw himself upon the mercy of Athena herself. The goddess of wisdom understood that this case was too complex for simple justice, too fundamental to be resolved by either mercy or punishment alone. She established the first court of human law, where mortal jurors would hear the arguments on both sides and render a verdict based on evidence and reason rather than emotional response. The trial that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred. Apollo himself served as Orestes' defender, arguing that the young man had acted under divine command and that a father's blood was more sacred than a mother's. The Erinyes presented their own case with terrible eloquence, reminding the court that matricide was the most unnatural of crimes, a violation of bonds that even gods should not be permitted to sever. When the human jurors cast their votes, the result was a tie, half supporting Orestes' acquittal, half demanding his conviction. Athena, serving as the deciding vote, chose mercy, arguing that the cycle of blood vengeance had to end somewhere and that Orestes had suffered enough for his crime. But she also recognized the Erinyes' essential role in maintaining cosmic justice. In a stroke of divine wisdom, Athena offered the Furies a new role and a new name. They would become the Eumenides, the kindly ones, protectors of Athens and guardians of justice in its most civilized form. They would still pursue the guilty and punish the wicked, but they would work within the framework of human law rather than operating as forces of pure vengeance. The transformation was not complete. The Erinyes retained their terrible appearance and their implacable nature, but they also gained a new dimension to their purpose, serving not just as avengers, but as deterrents, reminding potential criminals that justice might be delayed, but could never be permanently avoided. Their presence in the world became a guarantee that conscience would always have a voice, that guilt would always find expression, and that the innocent blood would never cry out forever without being heard. In quiet moments, when shadows gather in the corners of rooms and the wind carries sounds that might be voices, some say you can still hear the Erinyes at their work. They move through the world now, not as monsters, but as the living embodiment of moral consequence, ensuring that the cosmic balance between crime and punishment remains intact. Their story reminds us that justice is not always comfortable or convenient, and that some debts can only be paid in the currency of suffering and time. The gentle sound of a lyre drifts across the evening air, its melody so hauntingly beautiful that even the wind pauses to listen. This is music that speaks directly to the soul, bypassing the mind's careful defenses to touch something deeper and more vulnerable than conscious thought. It is the music of Orpheus, greatest of all mortal musicians, whose songs could charm wild beasts and make stones weep with longing. But tonight, his melody carries a note of sadness that seems to echo from the very foundations of the earth itself. Everyone knows the beginning of his story, how the son of the muse Calliope fell in love with the nymph Eurydice, how their wedding day ended in tragedy when a serpent's bite sent his beloved bride to the realm of the dead, how Orpheus's grief was so profound that his music made the very gods weep with sympathy. These are the verses that every bard learns, the tale that every mother tells her children when they ask about the power of love to transcend even death itself. But there is another version of this story, older and darker, that speaks of deception among the gods and a cruel test that was rigged from the very beginning. This version whispers that Orpheus's famous journey to the underworld, his legendary encounter with Hades and Persephone, may not have unfolded quite as the common tales suggest. When Orpheus first descended into the realm of the dead, carrying only his lyre and his desperate love, the journey nearly killed him before he ever reached Hades' throne. The living are not meant to walk the paths of the dead, and every step through those twilight realms burned his mortal flesh like acid. The air itself was poison to him, filled with the breath of things that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. Only his music sustained him, creating a bubble of life and beauty around him as he walked through landscapes of ash and shadow. The spirits of the dead gathered to hear him play, drawn by music that reminded them of the world they had lost. Ancient heroes paused in their eternal wanderings to listen. Even the tormented souls in the depths of Tartarus found temporary peace in his melodies. His song was a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, and for a brief moment, the boundary between them grew thin enough for love to cross. When he finally reached the throne room of Hades and Persephone, Orpheus played with every fiber of his being, pouring his love and grief into music that had never been heard in those dark halls. He sang of sunshine and flowers, of laughter and embrace, of all the things that made life precious and death unbearable. His melody painted pictures of Eurydice in the listeners' minds, her grace as she danced through meadows, her gentle voice calling his name, the way her eyes caught the light when she smiled. Hades himself, the stern lord of the dead, who had never been moved by any mortal plea, felt tears on his cheeks for the first time since his own abduction of Persephone. The queen of the underworld, remembering her own separation from the world above, added her voice to Orpheus's petition. Even the Furies, those implacable pursuers of justice, were momentarily subdued by music that spoke of love, stronger than law. The royal couple conferred in whispers, their decision already made, but the terms still being negotiated. When they finally spoke, their offer seemed like the answer to every prayer Orpheus had ever uttered. Eurydice would be restored to him, permitted to return to the world of the living as a special dispensation from the rulers of the dead. But there was one condition, a single restriction that seemed simple enough to follow. Orpheus must lead Eurydice back to the surface without looking at her until they both stood in the full light of the sun. He must trust that she followed behind him, must have faith that the gods would keep their word, must resist the overwhelming urge to confirm with his own eyes that his beloved was truly there. It seemed a small price to pay for such an impossible gift. But here the older version of the story diverges from the familiar tale. In this darker telling, the gods never intended to honor their agreement. Hades and Persephone had been moved by Orpheus's music, but they were still the rulers of the dead, bound by cosmic laws that even they could not break without consequences. The dead cannot simply return to life. Such an act would upset the fundamental balance of existence itself. So they devised a test that was designed to fail, a cruel mercy that would allow them to appear generous while ensuring that the natural order remained intact. They gave Eurydice a form that seemed solid, but was actually composed of shadow and memory, substantial enough to fool casual observation, but not quite real enough to survive in the world of the living. More crucially, they ensured that this phantom would begin to fade the moment it stepped onto the path leading back to life. Orpheus began the long journey upward, his heart singing with joy, despite the eerie silence behind him. He could sense Eurydice's presence, could almost feel the warmth of her breath on his neck, could hear what might have been the soft whisper of her footsteps on the rocky path. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to confirm that his greatest dream was actually coming true. But he held to his discipline with the determination of a man who had already lost everything once. The path seemed endless, winding through caverns that grew lighter by imperceptible degrees, past underground rivers that reflected no light, through galleries where the walls were carved with scenes from the lives of the dead. With each step, Orpheus felt his strength returning as he moved closer to the world he belonged to, but he also began to notice something troubling. The presence he had felt so strongly at the beginning of the journey was growing fainter. The sense of Eurydice walking behind him became less certain, more like a hope than a reality. Sometimes he thought he heard her voice calling his name, but when he strained to listen, there was only the echo of his own footsteps in the hollow corridors. Doubt began to creep into his mind like poison. Had the gods actually kept their promise, or had they simply allowed him to leave alone while maintaining the illusion that Eurydice followed? Was he climbing toward reunion or toward an even more crushing disappointment than his original loss? The uncertainty became almost unbearable, a weight that grew heavier with every step he took. As he neared the surface, with the first hint of natural light beginning to penetrate the darkness ahead, Orpheus could no longer sense any trace of his beloved's presence. The silence behind him had become complete, absolute, terrifying in its implications. Either Eurydice was there but hidden by some divine enchantment, or she had never been there at all, and he was about to emerge into the sunlight alone and even more heartbroken than before. In that moment of ultimate uncertainty, love overcame caution. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, Orpheus turned to look behind him, and there she was, Eurydice, beautiful as ever, reaching out to him with love shining in her eyes. But even as he looked, she began to fade like morning mist, her form becoming translucent, her voice growing distant as she spoke his name one final time. What the common version of the story interprets as Orpheus's failure, this darker telling reveals as the gods' deception. The phantom they had created was designed to vanish at the moment of looking, ensuring that Orpheus would believe he had lost her through his own weakness rather than through their unwillingness to truly restore her to life. It was a cruel kindness, allowing them to maintain their reputation for mercy while ensuring that the cosmic order remained undisturbed. Orpheus emerged into the sunlight alone, carrying not just the grief of loss, but the additional burden of believing himself responsible for that loss. The world above seemed gray and lifeless after his journey through the realm of the dead, and his music, when he could bring himself to play, carried a note of despair that made all who heard it want to weep. But the story does not end there. In the years that followed, as Orpheus wandered the world as a broken man, gradually gathering followers who were drawn to his tragic tale and his otherworldly music, whispers began to spread about the true nature of his journey to the underworld. Initiates in the mystery cults that formed around his legend claimed to know secrets that the common tales concealed. These mystics taught that Orpheus's real achievement was not the temporary recovery of Eurydice, but the knowledge he gained about the nature of death and the afterlife. His journey through the underworld had shown him truths that no living person had ever witnessed. The actual geography of the realm of the dead, the process by which souls were judged and assigned their eternal fates, the hidden connections between life and death that governed all existence. This knowledge became the foundation of the Orphic mysteries, secret religious practices that promised initiates a better fate in the afterlife through proper understanding of death's true nature. The followers of these mysteries believed that Orpheus had deliberately sacrificed his chance to recover Eurydice in order to bring back something more valuable, wisdom about the divine order that could benefit all humanity. They taught that the look backward was not a moment of weakness, but a conscious choice, a decision to accept loss in order to gain insight. In their interpretation, Orpheus understood that some gifts are too precious to be received without cost, and that true love sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice of letting go. Whether this darker version of the story represents historical truth or simply the evolution of myth over time remains a mystery, but it speaks to something profound about the nature of loss and the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of suffering. Sometimes, the greatest tragedy is not what actually happens to us, but our belief that we could have prevented it if only we had been stronger, wiser, or more faithful. In the end, perhaps the true power of the Orpheus myth lies not in its details, but in its recognition that love and loss are inextricably connected, that some journeys can only be made alone, and that the most beautiful music often emerges from the deepest sorrow. The lyre still sings in the evening air, its melody carrying both the memory of what was lost and the hope of what might yet be found. Far to the west, where the sun sets each evening beyond the wine-dark sea, there lies a peninsula shaped like a boot, stretched out to catch the warmth of the Mediterranean sun. This is the land that would one day be called Italy, but in the ancient times when gods still walked the earth, it was known by another name, Saturnia, the realm of the exiled Titan who once ruled all of creation. When Zeus and his siblings finally overthrew their father Cronus in the great war known as the Titanomachy, the defeated king of the Titans faced a choice that would define the rest of his immortal existence. He could submit to imprisonment in the dark depths of Tartarus alongside his fellow Titans, accepting eternal punishment for his crimes against his own children. Or he could accept exile from the known world, banishment to the distant lands beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where he might find some semblance of the peace that had been torn from him by his own paranoia and cruelty. Cronus chose exile, perhaps because some part of him recognized that his downfall had been the inevitable result of his own actions. The prophecy that had driven him to devour his children had been self-fulfilling. His very attempt to prevent his overthrow had guaranteed its occurrence. Now, stripped of his cosmic authority, but still possessed of his divine nature, he faced the prospect of starting anew, in a land where no one knew his history or feared his power. The journey westward was long and filled with the kind of solitary reflection that comes only to those who have lost everything they once held dear. Cronus traveled not in the golden chariot of his former glory, but as a simple wanderer, learning humility with each step he took away from the scenes of his former power. The familiar landmarks of his old kingdom disappeared behind him, replaced by strange coastlines and unfamiliar stars that seemed to chart a course toward some uncertain destiny. When he finally reached the shores of the Italian peninsula, Cronus found a land that was wild and untamed, inhabited by scattered tribes who lived close to the earth and practiced customs that seemed ancient even to a Titan's eyes. These people had never known the sophisticated civilization that had developed in the Greek lands. They lived in simple huts, cultivated their fields with primitive tools, and settled their disputes through personal combat rather than organized law. But there was something about their simplicity that spoke to the exiled god's wounded soul. Here was a chance to rule not through fear and domination, but through wisdom and benevolence. Here he could create the kind of just society that his own paranoia had prevented him from establishing during his cosmic reign. The golden age that poets sang about might not be just a memory of the distant past, but a possibility for the future. Cronus revealed himself gradually to the Italian tribes, not as a conquering deity demanding submission, but as a wise teacher offering knowledge that could improve their lives. He showed them how to cultivate grain more efficiently, how to preserve food against the lean seasons, how to work metals into tools that could make their labor more productive. Under his guidance, agriculture flourished in ways the natives had never imagined possible, but more importantly, he taught them about justice and law, about the possibility of resolving conflicts through reason rather than violence. He established courts where disputes could be heard and decided fairly, created systems of governance that protected the weak from the strong, and developed codes of behavior that promoted harmony within and between communities. For the first time in his existence, Cronus discovered the satisfaction that comes from using power to create rather than to destroy. The transformation of the land was remarkable. Where once there had been scattered settlements struggling for survival, prosperous cities began to rise, connected by well-maintained roads that facilitated trade and communication. Arts and crafts flourished as people found themselves with leisure time and resources to devote to beauty rather than mere survival. Music and poetry began to develop, carrying songs of gratitude for the wise king who had brought such prosperity to their land. This was the true golden age, not the mythical time of ease and plenty that existed only in nostalgia, but an actual period when divine wisdom was applied to human problems, with results that seemed miraculous to those who experienced them. The exiled Titan had found redemption, not through conquering new territories, but through learning to serve those who had once been beneath his notice. Under Cronus's rule, the concept of seasonal cycles took on new meaning. The god who had once devoured time itself now became its gentle shepherd, teaching the Italians to work in harmony with natural rhythms rather than fighting against them. Spring became a time of planting and new beginnings, summer a season of growth and abundance, autumn a period of harvest and gratitude, winter a time of rest and reflection. Each season had its proper activities and celebrations, creating a calendar that organized life around natural rather than arbitrary principles. The king established festivals that brought communities together in celebration of their shared prosperity. The Saturnalia, held during the winter solstice, became the most beloved of these observances. For 7 days, the normal hierarchies of society were suspended. Slaves sat at table with their masters, children made decisions for their families, and the king himself served meals to his subjects. It was a time when the fundamental equality of all beings under divine protection was celebrated and remembered. During these festivals, Cronus would speak to his people about the lessons he had learned through his own self-fall from power. He told them stories about the dangers of unchecked authority, the importance of listening to prophetic warnings rather than trying to thwart them, and the wisdom that could be gained through experiencing both triumph and defeat. His own transformation from tyrant to benevolent ruler became a teaching tale about the possibility of redemption for even the greatest sinners. The exiled Titan also shared his knowledge of agriculture with a generosity that would have been impossible during his paranoid reign over the cosmos. He taught the Italians about crop rotation, about the proper timing of planting and harvesting, about the selection and preservation of seeds that would ensure continued abundance. Under his guidance, the peninsula became a source of grain and wine that sustained not only its own population, but provided surplus for trade with distant lands. But perhaps most importantly, Cronus learned to rule without the constant fear that had destroyed his previous kingdom. He had no children to threaten his authority, no prophecies hanging over his head like an executioner's sword. For the first time in his existence, he could make decisions based on wisdom rather than anxiety, could plan for the future rather than desperately trying to prevent it from arriving. The peace that settled over the Italian peninsula during this golden reign was so profound that neighboring lands sent envoys to learn the secrets of such prosperity. These visitors found not a land ruled by terror and compulsion, but a society where justice was administered fairly, where abundance was shared generously, and where the arts of civilization flourished under the protection of law and custom. Stories of this golden age eventually reached the Greek lands, where they were received with a mixture of wonder and skepticism. How could the same Cronus, who had devoured his own children, have become a wise and benevolent ruler? Some dismissed these tales as mere propaganda or wishful thinking. Others saw in them proof that even the worst tyrants could find redemption if they were willing to learn from their mistakes and change their fundamental approach to power. As the centuries passed and the exiled Titan's direct influence faded from Italian memory, the principles he had established became so deeply embedded in the culture that they seemed to be natural laws rather than imported innovations. The concept of seasonal festivals, the emphasis on agricultural abundance, the belief in the possibility of just governance, all of these became part of the Italian character in ways that would influence the development of civilization for millennia to come. When the Romans eventually rose to dominate the peninsula, they inherited many of the customs and attitudes that Cronus had established during his golden reign. Their own god Saturn, clearly derived from memories of the exiled Titan, was celebrated as the deity of agriculture and just law. The Saturnalia continued to be observed, providing an annual reminder that even the most rigid hierarchies could be temporarily suspended in recognition of fundamental human equality. The story of Cronus in exile became more than just a tale of divine redemption. It became a template for understanding how power could be exercised responsibly, how defeated leaders could find new purpose through service rather than dominance, and how the lessons learned through failure could sometimes prove more valuable than those gained through easy success. In the twilight hours, when shadows grow long and the day's work is done, the memory of that golden reign still whispers promises about the possibility of creating societies based on wisdom rather than fear, abundance rather than scarcity, and hope rather than despair.